Imagine being alone at night when the world outside is silent, and suddenly, you hear a knock on your window. Or picture yourself camping deep in the woods, only to wake to whispers circling your tent, voices calling you out into the darkness. And what if, on a stormy night, someone stood motionless in the pouring rain, watching your home for hours without moving an inch? These are not just tales to scare you, they happen to real people. Tonight, you'll hear 3 terrifying true stories of what happens when the safety of home and the peace of nature are shattered by something, or someone, lurking in the dark. Story 1. In late 2021, I found myself staying at my grandparents' old house. They had both passed away years earlier, and the property had been left untouched for the most part. My parents sometimes used it as a vacation spot, but it wasn't somewhere anyone truly lived anymore. The house stood at the edge of a small, rural town surrounded by endless stretches of dark woods. During the day, it was peaceful. The creaking wooden floors and faint smell of dust mixed with pine always reminded me of my childhood visits. But at night, the house changed. The silence of the forest seemed heavier, almost suffocating, and the windows became like black mirrors that reflected only your own face back at you. One chilly evening in November, as I was locking the back door, I noticed movement near the fence. My neighbor, Mr. Carlson, was standing there. He was an older man, usually friendly, but that night he looked off. His face was pale, his posture stiff, and he kept glancing toward the tree line as though expecting something to emerge. He waved me over. I hesitated, then stepped outside. When I got close, he leaned in and spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Don't ignore the noises at night. If you hear knocking on the windows..." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Never look. Just stay inside." I gave a nervous laugh, unsure how to respond. It sounded like a bad attempt at a ghost story. I brushed it off, assuming he was either joking or trying to spook me. After all, I had spent plenty of nights here before and nothing had ever happened. But later that night, around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Then I heard it. 3 soft knocks against the living room window. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was slow, deliberate. My heart jumped into my throat. I told myself it was just a branch, maybe moved by the wind. But then, a few minutes later, the knocks came again, this time at the kitchen window, the one directly beneath my bedroom. I froze in bed, barely daring to breathe. Whoever, or whatever it was moving around the house. Slowly, testing the windows, every instinct screamed at me to look, to peek through the blinds and see who was out there. But Mr. Carlson's warning echoed in my mind. Never look. So I stayed still, clutching the blanket, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. The knocking came and went for what felt like hours, moving from one window to the next. Sometimes, it was soft, almost playful. Other times it was loud enough to rattle the glass. At one point, I heard what sounded like nails scraping along the siding, traveling from one end of the house to the other. I shut my eyes tight, praying for the night to end. Finally, the first gray light of dawn crept through the curtains. The noises stopped. I lay there for another hour, too afraid to move, until the sun was fully up. When I finally gathered the courage to check, my stomach dropped. On the living room window, smeared across the glass, were large, muddy handprints. Not just one or two, several, overlapping, as though someone had pressed their palms against the glass and dragged them downward. The kitchen window had them too. They were far too big to belong to a child. I never saw who left them, and I never stayed at that house overnight again. Story 2. In the summer of 2019, I decided to do something I had done countless times as a kid, camp in the woods behind my parents' house. It wasn't a huge forest, but it was thick enough that, once you stepped inside, the suburban world disappeared. The house vanished behind the trees, and all that remained was the smell of damp earth and the sound of leaves shifting in the wind. Had done this before, but that particular summer night felt strangely different. The woods were quieter than usual. The air was heavy, still, and even as the sun set, I realized how unsettling the silence was. Normally, the place would come alive with chirping crickets, buzzing insects, and the distant hoot of owls. But by midnight, the woods were silent, unnaturally. So, I sat in my small tent with my flashlight, trying to read a book, but the silence pressed on me. I could hear my own breathing, the rustle of the sleeping bag, even the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. Then I heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps outside the tent. I froze, every muscle in my body locking tight. At first, I told myself it had to be a deer. They wandered through here I held my breath and listened as the steps circled around me, crunching twigs and leaves. But then, I heard something else, whispering. Faint at first, barely audible, like the breeze carrying voices from far away. But there was no wind. The whispers grew clearer, raspy, almost human. More than one voice, low and overlapping. They were coming, from just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I couldn't make out the words at first. My heart pounded so hard it drowned them out. But as the minutes crawled by, I realized what they were saying. Come out. Come out. Over and over. My mouth went dry. My hands trembled as I slowly reached for the flashlight beside me. With every ounce of courage I could muster, I clicked it on and shined it against the wall of the tent, casting a weak glow outside. Nothing. No shadows. No figures. Just the pale outlines of trees. But the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, as though whoever or whatever was out there knew I was awake. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But the thought of unzipping that tent and stepping into the dark, where the voices were waiting, was worse than staying inside. So I curled up tight, clutching the flashlight, whispering to myself that morning would come. The voices didn't fade until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the fabric. Only then did the forest return to normal, the birds singing, the crickets chirping, as if nothing had happened. Exhausted but alive, I stepped out of the tent. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but then I looked down. Surrounding the tent were several small piles of stones, neatly arranged in a perfect circle. They hadn't been there the night before. I don't know who placed them, or how quietly they managed to do it without me hearing. All I know is that I never camped in those woods again. Story 3. It was a rainy November night in Seattle. The kind of night when the sky seems endless, dark clouds pressing down on the city, and the sound of water hammering rooftops drowns out nearly everything else. I was home alone in my small house, a cup of tea in hand, listening to a true crime podcast. The storm outside made the warmth inside feel comforting, until it didn't. Around 9:30 p.m., just as the story on my podcast was reaching a tense moment, I heard it, 3 loud knocks at the front door. My heart jumped. Visitors were rare at that hour, especially on a stormy night. I hesitated, then walked slowly toward the door. The rain pounded harder as I pressed my eye against the peephole. My stomach tightened. No one was there. Confused, I backed away and tried to laugh it off. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the storm had rattled something on the porch. I returned to the couch, trying to focus on the podcast again. But before long, knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, more deliberate. I froze. Slowly, I went back to the door and checked again. Nothing. The porch light shone on an empty doorstep, rain cascading down in sheets. By the third time, My heart was racing. Knock, knock, knock. Each hit reverberated through the house. I stood, motionless, too afraid to breathe. Whoever it was seemed patient, persistent. I knew I shouldn't open the door, but curiosity clawed at me. Instead of the peephole, I tiptoed to the narrow side window that overlooked the porch. Carefully, I pulled the curtain back just a sliver. That's when I saw him. A tall man, standing perfectly still in the pouring rain. He wore a soaked gray hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face. His posture was rigid, unnatural, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I could feel them. He was staring directly at my front door. My mouth went dry. My pulse thundered in my ears. He didn't knock again. He didn't move at all. He just stood there, rain dripping off his sleeves, pooling at his feet. Seconds turned into minutes. The storm roared on, but inside the house, it was dead silent. I was paralyzed, watching him. I whispered to myself to call the police, but fear held me back. What if moving drew his attention? What if he heard me dialing? So I waited. 10 minutes passed. 20. He never shifted, never spoke. Just stood there. Nearly an hour crawled by. My nerves were shredded. Finally, I gathered the courage to grab my phone and dial 911. My voice shook as I told the operator what was happening. When the police finally arrived, lights flashing, I dared to peek outside again. The porch was empty. The tall man was gone. But as the officers searched the yard with their flashlights, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. Across the wet boards of my porch and down the steps were muddy boot prints. They didn't lead toward the street. They didn't end at the driveway. They trailed off into the dense woods behind my house, and they never came back out.